Hi everyone, welcome to this session about FHIRPath presented by Mirjam. My name is Lillian from FHIR, and I will be the moderator during this session. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A of this session and I will monitor them for you. So over to you, Mirjam.
Thank you, Lillian. So hello all, welcome to this introduction to FHIRPath presentation. I am Mirjam. I work for a company called FHIR, which you by now might know. At FHIR, we can provide you with all the software and tools and training you might need to bring FHIR to life. I've been part of the FHIR team at FHIR since 2012, so almost since the beginning of FHIR. And I am mainly responsible for the FHIR training courses that we offer. FHIRPath is a navigation and extraction language. Some people could compare it with XPath, although nowadays less and less people use XPath, but it's meant to be used in combination with FHIR. One of the things you might notice is if you look at the FHIRPath specification, you do see that there is a release attached to that. And so in this case, you can see it's version 2. This doesn't have anything to do with the FHIR version that you're using. FHIRPath is a separate standard and you can use it throughout all kinds of FHIR versions. Just don't take too big a look at that number in order to not get confused. FHIRPath is a maintained specification, also maintained by HL7. So that is why it has its own cycle of going through those versions. You can find the FHIRPath specification on the link below, just hl7.org/FHIRPath, and you will get to one big page describing this particular standard. So what you can do with FHIRPath is use a graph and then traverse through that graph. It has a syntax that's based on Fluent interface. So, well, if you're familiar with that, then you might encounter some things in FHIRPath that you already know. Whenever you are going to use FHIRPath expressions, they will result in collections. So if you ask for something, then you will always have to be aware that the response out of that expression will be a collection. And that also sometimes does mean that you could, if you compare that, you could run into things you might not be used to. So I would advise you to take a look at the page because it describes those kind of things that you might think will happen and can go wrong if you didn't fill in the correct FHIRPath expression. It is platform independent, just like we have a platform independence for FHIR, but also model independent. It doesn't matter what kind of structure you have, as long as you can put it inside of a hierarchical structure, a graph, then you can use FHIRPath to deal with that data. So that is not limited to FHIR, even though the name says FHIRPath, but that was a result of this being specified in combination with the FHIR specification to do things within that. Well, during this presentation, I will show you where FHIR uses FHIRPath, and I also will try to end with a demo to show you some FHIRPath expressions. So in FHIR, what you will see is that you can see FHIRPath whenever you need to point to a part of a resource instance. And this is useful, for example, when you are going to create search parameters, or if you have a FHIR patch where you just want to update a certain part of a FHIR resource. These search parameters, the predefined ones in FHIR, but also the custom ones you can define yourselves, they will have that FHIRPath expression. And that means that if you have a server that can read that FHIRPath expression, that server can use your search parameter in order to index on that particular part of the structure you point to with your expression. Also, we do find FHIRPath whenever you see profiles, if there are extra constraints, or sometimes also called invariants, for a particular structure, that can also be expressed with a FHIRPath expression. There are some of those rules, they go beyond just simple cardinality rules. They are already in the FHIR specification as well, but if you use them in your profiles, you can use your own FHIRPath expressions. Also, what we've seen a FHIRPath being used for is to extract data from an instance and then, for example, use that to create that human readable text that can be part of the resource. So you could, if a resource does not have that human readable text part added to it, you could run such a narrative generator tool which works with FHIRPath expressions and then retrieve certain parts of the data out of the resource instance and create your human readable narrative for it. So looking at the FHIRPath in the specification, if you look at search parameters, at the bottom of each resource type, you will see a table of those search parameters. You will see that you have an expression on those search parameters. And actually that expression is a FHIRPath expression. It can be really simple, just pointing to an instance within that structure. So for example, for patient.active and patient.address, well, that's almost self-explanatory, right? It's the active field within patient or the address field within patient. But you can also see that we can create more complex structures. In this case, well, it's the email search parameter. And the FHIRPath expression indicates that the system should look at the telecom field and then check whether the system within that telecom field is filled with email. Of course, that will be the email value that you want to index on for that particular search parameter. I also mentioned that we have these extra rules, these extra constraints that you can find, and those are listed here as well. So you can see that we have on organization, in this case, we have an expression. It always will have a key, so that's this part on the left, org1, and then it will have an expression indicating something. So in this case, the organization has to have the identifier together with the name has to be more than 0. So you can see whether there's a name or an identifier or both in there, but there has to be at least one. Of course, you also can see that there's a nice description of that. So if you do not understand the expression right away, the author of that expression will have filled in a description. That description also can be used by a validator to then indicate what was wrong if you create a resource instance that violates this. The level on this invariant will indicate whether it's a real error or a warning. So whenever it says rule, that means that this is a hard rule. You will have to satisfy that rule in order to have a valid instance of the data. Well, so let me take a look at what we could have. So in this example, we have a patient. This is the patient called Wouter Gert Kramer, which is the name for Ewout, actually. And you can see the patient also has a second name, but for brevity, we've left it out of the slide. And the active field has been filled in with a value and an extension. Well, if we want to do something with FHIRPath, what we need to do is represent this data as a tree. So we are going to do just that. We start out with the root object, which is, of course, our patient. And then you can see the fields within the patient in there. And if they have subfields, you will find them as well. So this is the first step. Our data is represented as a tree. And now we can use those FHIRPath expressions to extract data from this. So we are going to navigate by the name, and in this case, what we can navigate is to the patient.name.given. So we just start out at the root point, then we walk to the name part, and then we find given. So you can see that done there. I mentioned collections. As you can see, we have 2 names, so there will be 2 names in this collection. And from all those, the given names will be selected in this case. So that will result in a complete collection, also with the given names of the second name, if they exist. We could also leave out patient because that's just our root object, and usually you are on the root object anyway when you start out. So it's not necessary to repeat that, but for examples, we usually do add the resource type as well. You can also ask, for example, to have all of the children of a particular part. So we can take a look at patient.children, which is a function that will return a collection of all of the children of patient. Those will be the direct children. If you want to have all of the other sub-children as well, then it's called descendants, and that will result in a collection of all of the parts that you can see that have a nice red box around them in my slide. We can also make combinations. In this case, what we can take a look at is the patient's descendants and then the use field. And we can check that for a value as well. But in this case, we just select that use field, and then that will result in a collection of just that use part in there. Well, I can't mention it enough. Everything is in FHIRPath will result in a collection, and then you can do things with that. So for example, we could count all of them. So if you want to know how many name objects there are in the patient, we can do that count. We can also select just the first or the last of a certain collection. And you can see that in my second example there, where I have the patient's name, and I take the first name of that, and then I move within that first name to the given, which again is a list of things in FHIR. So that will be a collection of given names as well. And then we can select the last one of those. If some field is just a field that can only occur once, just like active, then of course the first one will always be the same object as when you would not put on that first method there. So every function returns a collection as well. Now, I mentioned that we can filter on certain things, and one of the options to do so is with the where function. That where function takes an argument, and then you can use those to search. So in this case, if we would look for patients, the name objects where the use equals official, then we would have the system retrieve all of, or look at all of the users within all of the names of that patient, and then find the one that has official as the filled in value. And what you will get returned in this case is the name, because the name is the one that we are asking for, and the name has to contain a use field set to official. So my collection for this expression will be this one name here. Whenever you are going to do profiling, it is important to be able to create those extra constraints that can then result in a true or a false value. And one of the things that we see often is that you check whether some field has been filled in, so whether it exists or whether it is empty. For the exists function, you can also fill in criteria as well. You can see that we do that. You can leave it empty if you just want to know whether that identifier has been filled in at least once, then the exists is okay. But if you want to have any identifiers, check whether they exist with the use set to official, then this is the criteria that you put in. And these criteria you can add to them as well. You can use the and the or operators, the Boolean type of operators, in order to use a mix of particular criteria that you might have. So I mentioned and or in that previous slide, but also quite often we see implies, which will be an operator that if the first part of the expression evaluates to true, then the second part after the implies needs to also evaluate to true for the complete expression to evaluate to true. So you can check something like, if this field in my resource is filled in, then another field has to be filled in as as well, or then another field has to have a certain value with that implies functionality. Because suppose that first field has not been filled in, then that whole expression is okay. It will just be ignored because the first part already is false. Then the whole implies expression will evaluate to true. Of course, you can also do comparisons. So if you have any numbers or dates or things like that, you can use the comparators that we have on the slide. And if you have strings, you can do nice things with manipulation. I kind of like the matches one because you can check whether a particular string matches a regular expression that you give. But of course, you can also take a look at how a string, with what characters it starts, whether there's a particular substring that is within that string. And then you can also select parts of strings out of that with these string manipulation functions. Next to that, you also can do things for concatenating and counting, etc., with the operators that you see at the last part of my slide here. If you are going to create profiles and you run into some kind of requirement that you have that you cannot solve with just simple cardinality constraints or with changing a data type or something like that, but you need these extra rules that I mentioned previously, then you are going to create a formal constraint with FHIRPath expressions. The way to do that is, of course, first take a look at what the requirement is. So you can see I have two requirements here. A patient's birth date must be on or before today's date. Okay, we could check if that the field is filled in, what today's date is, and then compare those two. And that can, of course, evaluate to true or false. So that's something we can do with the FHIRPath expression. The second one, it says, if a cholesterol value result is not available, use the note field. This is one that you could put on an observation resource type. The observation resource can take a value of type quantity, which could be a cholesterol value. If that result is not available, if it's empty, that's value quantity, then use the note field, which is another field within observation. You can see in this case that we have two fields involved, two elements within the observation resource type. It's possible, both of them. The first one is just on a single element, just on the patient birth date and checking that. And the second expression would be on multiple elements in the resource instance. As I said, it has to evaluate to true or false, because then if anyone wants to validate resource instances against your profile, a validator can check this and then can give an error when it evaluates to false. When you do this, what you will have to think about is that key. I mentioned org1 in my previous slide for the constraints on organization. That is what you will encounter in the FHIR specification. A 3-letter indication, a dash, and then a number indicating these 3 letters indicating the resource type it works on or the data type it is a rule for. So org is organization, and then -1 was what we looked at. As a profile author, if you create these extra constraints, you will also invent a key for that particular constraint. It's up to you to make some kind of unique key for that. Then what you will also specify is whether this is an error or a warning. That's that rule or warning part in the FHIR spec. And of course, what you will do then is put this particular constraint on someplace within your resource tree. So let us take a look at that. That second one, where we have two fields. We have to take a look at this and then create that FHIRPath expression. If you look at this correctly, then you see that you can fill in both. It's just that they can't be both empty. And that can be put inside of a FHIRPath expression. So what we can do is take a look at the value field, make sure that that's been checked against the quantity data type, and then we say exists in order to check whether it's filled in or not. Then the or, and then note exists. So either of them have to be filled in. And this expression now can be that FHIRPath rule that we put somewhere in our observation. Where would you put that particular constraint? You will have to check which fields are involved, and then what you do is take their common parent. So in this case, if you look at the observation resource type, you will see that value quantity is right underneath that top level of observation, and so is node. So that means that you would put, in this case, the constraint on the top level, on the observation level. And then from both the value field and the node field, you refer back to the key that you have created for this constraint, that unique key that I mentioned in the previous slide. So, well, as you can see, we check those two, and then we would put that particular constraint or the constraint on the observation level, and we would put a reference to that constraint on the value quantity and the node fields. Well, this was in very quick overview what you can do with FHIRPath. But of course, what you probably also want to do is test out some FHIRPath expressions when you start working with this. So you can have a look at these links. And of course, these slides will be made available later on. They should appear on this session in the Whova app soon. And then you can just click on them. One is the FHIRPath.js, which is an online tool, but you can also take a look at the FHIRPath tester from Brian Postlethwaite, and he has been kind enough to make that an open source project, so you can see how he has implemented that in C#, and also has created a Microsoft executable for that particular tester tool. What I'm going to do now is show you a couple of those things, and hopefully you will get an idea of where you can find this in the specification, and I will also just demo a couple of those FHIRPath expressions. Of course, feel free to already put some questions in the Q&A, because after this we will still have some time to do that live Q&A. Okay, so let me just first take a look at the FHIR specification. Well, actually, this is the FHIRPath specification, as you can see from my URL on top, FHIRPath, just to let you see what this particular page has. So this is just, as I said, one big page, and you can see we have this whole table of contents here. You can see there are functions, there are expressions, there are operations, and all kinds of other things. Well, if you scroll down on this page, you will find some familiar things. For example, this picture here with the tree structure of that patient resource that we've seen. But you can also just take a look at this, and for example, we could find the exists, if I type that in correctly, yes. So you can just see that we can take a look at that. In this case, this is just the first part there where you see we have 17 matches, but you do see that there are some examples on this page as well. So if you run into any requirement that you might have, or an expression that you would want to construct, this page is a really good documentation page. It has a lot of examples. So feel free to just check them out and copy paste them and change them to your own needs. In the FHIR specification itself, I will just show you how you can see whether a particular resource has extra constraints, for those of you who are not familiar with that. So let me go to the resource list there, and we can just pick any of them. Well, let me just find bundle. Okay, so it doesn't matter which resource type you have. Most of them will have some extra rules. So this is the bundle resource type. And what you can see, if you look at the tree structure here, you can see that there's sometimes this flag, an I. That's the I for invariant. And if you hover over it, you can see that as well. This element has or is affected by some invariants. Also, you can see that we have a list of these rules on here. So this is already a nice indication of what these particular invariants are. But you can see they are there on other levels as well. So you can see this total is affected by an invariant. Even though the rule is not listed here, this is an element that is used somehow in one of these rules. And sometimes in this case, for example, on the entry, you can see that we also have a couple of rules added to that as well. If you want to have an overview for that particular resource type, just scroll down until you see this table with constraints. And then you will see the keys that I mentioned. Bundle BDL is the shorthand for that in FHIR. And then a number attached to that as well. You see the level, so a rule means that this rule has to be satisfied, otherwise your resource instance is not valid. And then you can see what the expression is. If you start out creating FHIRPath expressions, it is really useful to, next to reading the FHIRPath page, also check these expressions on the FHIR website as well, because they contain a lot of expressions that you might want to reuse and adapt for your own needs. Well, for example, we can see that total that says, okay, the total field has to be empty, or the search set has to be filled in for type, or history has to be filled in for type, meaning that the total field can only be filled in if you have a search set bundle as a search result or a history type bundle. So that is where you can find those constraints. Of course, you can create them yourselves as well if you have a profiling tool like the Forge tool that we have. That is a Windows-based tool, and even though I have my virtual machine running, I will see how much time we have. I have it running for just in case we have any questions to show you something, but I would like to stay on websites and things that I can just run natively. So this is that one tool that I mentioned. I also have a tab open for that FHIRPath tester tool, but that is just the GitHub repository where you can find the source code for it. And this is that online FHIRPath tester. So it's on hl7.github.io and then /FHIRPath.js. What you can see when you start that page is that you have a patient loaded into it already. That's the example patient. And there's also an example FHIRPath expression on the top there. So you can see we have an expression that looks at the names where the use is set to usual and then takes the first given name. At the side here, you see the result of that. So it says Jim. Well, if you look at this particular patient, you will see that we have a couple of names. We have an official one, we have a usual one, and a maiden one. And well, our selector here has used the criteria of the use being set to usual. So that's that second one. And you can see, yes, it does have a given name. So that is Jim. Of course, we could also have done this. We can just change it and test out what we have there. So whenever I change something in the expression, it will automatically update that particular data extraction on the right-hand side. Well, as I said, you can also do other things. We could, for example, say, is the patient's birth date field, is that on or before today or not? This is a function that is available, the today function, which of course will give us the day of today. And this expression is an expression that evaluates to true or false. So in this case, you can see it's true. If I change the birth date to reflect a different one, so let me say 2021, you can immediately see that my result is false. This patient was born in the future, which of course is, well, almost never possible. So those kind of expressions can be done. And as I mentioned, there's also a nice expression or a nice manipulation things that you can do. I do like that string one, where you could, for example, say we are going to look at the patient's address. And then, if I want to do this correctly, I should look at the first address because it can result in multiple addresses. But in this case, well, you can see from my particular information, I only have one. And I could check the postal code field in order to check whether that matches some kind of regular expression. So let me take a look at this. Hopefully it works. Okay, so my expression in this case says that the postal code has to, well, let me just make it a nice start and end as well. You will have to know a bit about irregular expressions. I don't know too much, but I know a couple of those things, and I have, of course, looked this up. But you can see we check the postal code to see if it matches the D for digit, 4 digits, and it starts with it and it ends with that. So there's nothing else added to that postal code. So in this case, we have a true evaluation at the side, as you can see. But if I had said, okay, this is had to be 3 digits, then now it is false. So well, in the Netherlands, we have 4 digits, and then we would have 4 characters. So that would be A to Z. Sorry, 2 characters. And of course, this does not match that, but if I would put 2 characters next to it, it reflects, well, it looks like a Dutch postal code. And as you can see, it evaluates to true. So if you look at profiles that will be supplied to you by your organizations, for example, in the Netherlands, we have an NL Core patient profile, then you can find these types of constraints. And actually this one is there for the address for a patient. So not necessarily on the patient resource itself in the NL Core patient, but in the address type that we use in the Netherlands. This is all possible with FHIRPath expressions. And of course, as I also mentioned, for search parameters, you put in a FHIRPath expression as well. Let me just quickly see if I have one lying around. I should have one. Oh, if I, this one, for example. If you look at search parameters, of course, in the FHIR specification, you have a standard list of search parameters possible. Suppose there would be a field that you want to be able to search on, but there's no default search parameter, no standard search parameter. You can create your own search parameter resource. And then, of course, you will still need to implement support. Some servers will be able to dynamically ingest this. And then what they will do is check the expression on the particular parameter. So my search parameter here lists some metadata details, and I have given it a code. That's the thing that I put on the URL. And what you can see, we look at the patient resource type. And I have filled in a nice description, but of course what we are here for, the FHIRPath expression, is listed here. The birthplace is something that is not a standard field in the FHIR patients. So we have to use a a standard extension. That would be the patient birthplace extension. For extensions, you usually do not have standard search parameters. So what I can do is just create this expression. Look at the patient resource type, then take a look at the extension array. Select this particular extension. That's the canonical URL of the extension, which is available on the extension definition. And then we look at the value of that, which would be the value inside of that extension. This means that if my server can consume this or can be implemented to support this, it just needs to index on that particular field within the structure in order to get those values out, and later on for me, of course, to be able to search on birthplaces. Okay, so those were the things that I wanted to show you. Over to Lillian, you are looking at the Q&A, I think. So are there any questions for me?
Yes, there's still a couple of questions left. One of them is, could you access the references resource data? So for example, you want to have the general practitioner name from the patient resource.
It is a good question. I will just stop my share for a bit so you can see me. It is a good question, but if you look at the patient, then in the patient's data, there is only this general practitioner field that has a reference to the general practitioner. It does not have the practitioner's name. And unless that is put inside of the display field on the reference, of course, and then it would be possible to take it out. But you can, of course, extract that particular reference on the general practitioner field. You will have to do another call to the system in order to retrieve the practitioner's data, just like you would have to do when you would communicate those resources. And then only then you can check the outcome for the name of the practitioner. So either it has to be on the display value, because if we only have that patient object, that's just what it is. If it isn't filled in inside of that data, my FHIRPath expression will not necessarily look up the references right away. You will have to have some code around that.
Okay, thank you. So next question is, when you're writing a FHIRPath expression, extracting a response category from the bundle, do you always go by bundle entry, where resource type is category name, or do you extra using the extension?
Not sure if I understand the question correctly. You will have to do a selection, of course, with your FHIRPath. FHIRPath is only meant for navigating through a tree and also extracting data out of that or checking data against values. So if you want something specific, you can make your FHIRPath expression so specific as you would want. Or, of course, if you have a FHIRPath navigator in your code, which, by the way, standard libraries have, so the Happy Library, the .NET SDK, they all have support for FHIRPath. You can already walk inside of the bundle to that entry component part, so the entries. And then perhaps the rest of your FHIRPath traversal might be a bit more or less complicated, I should say. So it might be more accessible from that point. But I am afraid that that doesn't completely answer your question. So please could the one who asked that either put some clarification in the Q&A, or perhaps it's also possible to unmute and ask the question to me.
So I think you will have either answered it or there will be a clarification in the Q&A.
Yeah. We will check that after this session as well, right? So if anything comes up afterwards, please do ask again, and we will check that.
We still have some more time for questions, so I will just continue reading them. When should FHIRPath be used instead of FHIR search?
FHIR search actually is the communication of FHIR resources between systems, so between a client server or between two server systems. So you can perform a search with a RESTful interaction. You can't do that with FHIRPath. FHIRPath assumes that you have the data already. So you will have to have done a search first, and then you can use FHIRPath in order to check certain parts of that search result, like that bundle that was just mentioned. You can walk through that bundle and extract data from that, or check data with a FHIRPath expression. So they're completely different concepts, actually. One is communicating data, the other is taking a look at the data and then doing stuff with that. Anything more?
Yes, there is, but I'm having some trouble with my internet. I don't know if you can see it yourself, but there's...
I would have to check the Hoover app site for that. So let me see. I can find it, but... So this session there. So let me see. Okay, yeah, so there I do see a question about that patient's contact name. If that patient has indeed an extension on that contact name, then you can just retrieve the whole extension by looking at the extension. For my search parameters, I wanted to have a specific extension checked and indexed on. So that was why I added that URL part to it. So not sure was there, I'm not sure if I had that patient on the particular with an extension on there. Okay, so that will be that one. Let me see if I let me see if we can get that to work. So I have that particular patient again on this FHIRPath tester here, that FHIRPath.js, and that's the contact, and then it is on the family field and has an extension. So that would be something like patient .contact, sorry, family. Yeah, so I can see that something is not working with that particular contact part. So the contact one, as you can see, we have here. If we stop at contact, then it says .family. It doesn't want to do that. Well, oh, sorry, I forget the name. So yeah, of course, it's the name.family. And that should give me that name again. Now, in this case, this FHIRPath tester tool doesn't necessarily want to work with everything possible. So I would expect that I could do something like extension. But as you can see, that does not result in anything. It might have to do with the fact that in JSON and also in YAML on the family field, which is a primitive field only taking a string, the extension looks like _family. So if you have this in code, you could just work with the expression as I have it on here. But in my tester, I would have to take a look at the underscore. Well, no, not _family as well. Yeah, so I would have to take a look at that, how to find this particular one in this FHIRPath demo tool. It is possible. So as I mentioned with my search parameter, you can just check that particular extension field on a resource. Perhaps if this was done in XML, it would be less difficult than this. But it is definitely possible with the FHIRPath expression. But of course, we do run sometimes into limits of the testing tools that might be out there. I am almost sure that if we would do that in the FHIRPath tester that Brian wrote, that it would just give me the result that I expected. So did you find another question again, Lillian, perhaps?
Yes. So any suggestion on how we may use FHIRPath to update a field?
No, because FHIRPath actually is not meant to update a field. It's meant to extract data from a structure you would have. So that would be a read-only structure in that case, you would have to use other code around that in order to then update that particular field that you wanted to update. FHIRPath is not meant to do that. It's just for extracting, navigating, and comparing data.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can you please talk about how .s works? To my understanding, .s works kind of like a selection on the X field. I wonder whether .s works as a, wait.
I couldn't really answer that right now. So
okay.
Whoever sent that question, I will take a look at that after this session. Well, after my next session, actually. But I will get back to you to get some more clarification on what you want to achieve and whether I can explain something about that.
Okay, maybe one final question then, because we are almost out of time. How to send a FHIRPath query via REST API?
FHIRPath in REST API is only used if you perform a patch interaction, meaning that you can use that FHIRPath expression in order to indicate what kind of field the server should be updating with the data that you send. So your FHIRPath expression points to a field, and you will also send in the data that you want it to be changed to. And the server then has to make sure to go to that field and really update it with extra code around it, as I mentioned previously. So it's only in the data you send on the body of a patch request that you would use FHIRPath there.
Okay, so thank you, Mirjam, for a very clear presentation, and thank everyone for listening. We are happy to hear your feedback on this session, so please use the rate functionality in the Woofa app. And also note that the Q&A will still be open after this session, so you can still post your questions there, and Mirjam will take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Lillian, for helping me out with the moderating.